A couple of people at the immigration department, so...
You've got some friends there?
Yes, we do. And they let us by.
February 1968. No spotlit stages, no roaring crowds, just a cold bathroom floor in a Harlem apartment, a discarded syringe, and a heart that stopped beating at 25. When they buried Frankie Lymon, the big shot record execs and fair-weather famous friends who built fortunes off his golden voice were nowhere to be found. The boy who once had the whole world singing along to his every word was left with a silent room, an empty grave, and an unfinished story. Did no one actually show up to his funeral? The fall, shadows, and needles. How does a kid who had the whole damn world in the palm of his hands end up lying dead on his grandmother's bathroom floor before his 26th birthday? Let's look past the crisp suits, the flashing studio cameras, and that infectious million-dollar smile that captured America in 1956 to relate to the tragedy of Frankie Lymon. By the time the decade flipped, the bright lights had completely blinded him, leaving a broke, desperate young man stumbling through the cold dark. The downfall didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it hit with the force of a runaway freight train. It started with the most natural thing in the world, a boy's voice changing. When Frankie hit puberty, the sweet, effortless soprano that had turned Why Do Fools Fall in Love into an international anthem began to crack and deepen. To the music executives who saw him as nothing more than a pint-sized cash register, that physiological shift wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a total disaster. Almost overnight, the hit records stopped coming. The radio stations moved on to the next fresh-faced craze, and the swarms of adoring fans vanished into thin air. Suddenly, the teenager who used to buy custom-tailored suits and wave to screaming crowds found himself isolated, broke, and completely forgotten. The sudden, violent drop from global superstardom to absolute obscurity was too much for a kid to process. To numb the crushing weight of irrelevance, Frankie turned to the dark underbelly of New York City, falling headfirst into a heavy substance addiction at just 15 years old. The very street corners where he used to sing doo-wop harmonies were now the places where he chased his next fix. For years, his life became a brutal cycle of short-lived rehab stints, relapse, and run-ins with the law. The sweet-faced boy who once sang for European royalty was now dodging cops and hustling for substance money. By 1966, in a desperate attempt to clean up his act and escape the poisonous influences of the city, Frankie enlisted in the United States Army. He was stationed at Fort Gordon in Georgia, far away from the Harlem streets that were slowly consuming him. But the military couldn't wash away his demons. He struggled with discipline, repeatedly went absent without leave, and spent his nights sneaking off to sing in small-town southern bars just to feel that old high of a crowd applauding. While down in the South, he met a quiet schoolteacher named Emira Eagle. For a brief moment, it looked like Frankie might actually survive his own life. They got married, he stayed relatively clean, and he began writing new songs, convinced that he still had a second act left in him. But New York was always calling, whispering promises of a grand comeback that he just couldn't resist. In early 1968, Frankie received a lifeline. A small independent record label, Roulette Records, offered him a chance to step back into a real studio and cut new tracks. It was the moment he had been praying for, a shot at redemption, a chance to show the world that Frankie Lymon wasn't a washed-up memory. He packed his bags, left Georgia, and headed back up north to Harlem. He moved into his grandmother's modest apartment on West 161st Street, using it as a home base while preparing for his big recording session. He was supposed to enter the studio on February 28th to record his brand new material. The night before, celebrating his return to the Big Apple and the revival of his career, Frankie surrendered to his oldest and deadliest temptation. He took a heavy dose of substance far stronger than his body, weakened by years of military life and sporadic sobriety, could handle. Sometime during the cold morning hours of February 27, 1968, his body gave out. His grandmother found him unresponsive on the bathroom floor. By the time the ambulance arrived, the former teenage king of doo-wop was gone. There were no red carpets or news cameras waiting outside the building. The high-flying music moguls who made millions off his back were nowhere in sight. Frankie Lymon died stripped of his fame, his fortune, and his youth, leaving behind nothing but a tragic cautionary tale about what happens when the music industry chews up a child and spits him out into the night. So, if his death was a quiet tragedy hidden away in a Harlem apartment, what happened when the final curtain fell and they buried him? The chaos of romance, wives, lies, and legal wars. If you thought Frankie Lymon's life ended when his heart stopped beating on that Harlem bathroom floor, you don't know the half of it. Death didn't bring peace to Frankie's memory. Instead, it kicked open the door to a sprawling, sensational circus of greed, love, and bitter betrayal. Long after the cold earth settled over his unmarked Bronx grave, the ghost of Frankie Lymon found itself dragged straight into the middle of one of the absolute messiest, most bizarre court battles in music history. The central question driving the madness: who had the rightful claim to be the legal widow of the teenage superstar? To understand how three separate women ended up fighting over his name, you have to look at the absolute wreckage of Frankie's romantic life. He was a smooth-talking, insanely charismatic prodigy who swept women off their feet long before he was old enough to legally buy a drink. But as his career fell apart and his substance dependency spiraled out of control, his approach to relationships became just as chaotic and reckless as his addiction. First came Elizabeth Waters. Back in the early 60s, while Frankie was desperately trying to keep his career afloat, he crossed paths with Elizabeth in Philadelphia. They hit it off fast, moved in together, and by 1964, they decided to tie the knot in a quickie ceremony in Alexandria, Virginia. On paper, it looked like a fresh start. In reality, it was built on quicksand. Frankie was constantly on the run from his own life, leaving behind unpaid bills, legal threats, and broken promises. To make matters infinitely worse, Elizabeth had a prior marriage that hadn't been fully dissolved before she said, "I do" to Frankie. That tiny, overlooked legal detail would later explode into a devastating legal bomb. While still technically attached to Elizabeth, Frankie's wandering eye and nomadic lifestyle led him straight into the arms of musical royalty, Zola Taylor, the stunning contralto vocalist for the legendary doo-wop group The Platters. Zola was a big star in her own right, glamorous, talented, and fiercely independent. The two hit it off instantly, bonded by the shared trauma of childhood fame and the relentless pressures of the music industry. In 1965, they allegedly held a private wedding ceremony in Tijuana, Mexico. It was a whirlwind, passionate affair, but it was also fueled by heavy partying and constant volatile arguments. They lived like two fireworks colliding in midair, burning insanely bright before blowing completely apart. Then came the final chapter. Seeking an escape from his mounting debts and the ruthless temptations of New York City, Frankie joined the Army and got posted down south to Fort Gordon, Georgia. That was where he met Amira Eagle, a quiet, respectable elementary school teacher who knew almost nothing about his former life as a teenage pop idol. To Amira, Frankie wasn't a fallen superstar or a junkie. He was just a polite, soft-spoken guy trying to get his act together. In June 1967, they officially married in a local Georgia church. Out of all three women, Amira was the only one who actually shared a peaceful home with him in his final months, right up until he packed his bags for that doomed comeback trip to Harlem. For nearly 20 years after his death, none of this really mattered. Frankie had died completely broke, leaving behind zero money, zero real estate, and zero assets to speak of. His memory faded into forgotten music trivia, and his body remained in a completely unmarked grave at St. Raymond's Cemetery. Then came the late 80s, and everything changed. Thanks to federal copyright law changes and a massive push to reclaim stolen royalties, Frankie's famous catalog, specifically the massive evergreen hit "Why Do Fools Fall in Love," suddenly started generating millions of dollars in back pay. Almost overnight, the estate of Frankie Lymon wasn't just a sad memory anymore. It was a colossal gold mine waiting to be claimed. The moment the smell of millions hit the air, the legal gloves came completely off. Emira Eagle stepped forward as the rightful widow, pointing to her official Georgia marriage license and her quiet life with Frankie. But then Elizabeth Waters came swinging in from Philadelphia, claiming her 1964 marriage predated Emira's, asserting she was the one true legal wife. Not to be outdone, Zola Taylor marched into the courtroom with headlines blazing, insisting her 1965 union made her the legitimate heir to the fortune. What followed was a legal bloodbath that played out like a primetime soap opera. Lawyers threw mud, dug through decades-old hotel registries, debated the legal validity of Mexican wedding certificates, and dragged every embarrassing secret of Frankie's personal life directly into the public eye. The court battle dragged on for years, captivating the media and turning Frankie's tragic life into a circus of tabloid gossip. Ultimately, the judge ruled that Elizabeth's marriage was void due to her previous divorce timeline, and Zola couldn't produce concrete legal proof of her Mexican ceremony. Emira Eagle walked away as the sole legal widow, inheriting the millions in royalties that Frankie was denied his entire life. Yet, long before his death unleashed this insane war among his surviving wives, how did a poor kid from Harlem build the very legacy they were tearing each other apart to own? From Shoeshine Box to national anthem of doo-wop, you have to go back to where it all began. The loud, sun-drenched asphalt jungle of Harlem in the mid-50s to understand how Frankie Lymon's name could command millions long after he was in the ground. Long before the shiny suits, the limousine rides, and the screaming European crowds, Frankie was just another street kid trying to hustle up pocket change on the corner of 161st Street. He was born into a musical family in September 1942. His father was a truck driver who sang in a local gospel group, meaning Frankie grew up with church harmonies ringing in his ears from the moment he could walk. But while gospel music laid his foundation, the street corners of New York City provided his true baptism. In those days, Harlem was an open-air concert hall. On any given summer evening, dozens of young vocal groups would cluster under street lights, using the natural reverb of brick alleyways to polish their complex, multi-part harmonies. Frankie was 10 years old when he started shining shoes to help his family pay the bills. He carried a wooden kit over his shoulder, working the sidewalks near Harlem's famous Apollo Theater. But even then, he wasn't just looking at people's shoes. He was listening to the rhythms of the city. He had an unearthly, razor-sharp soprano voice, a crystalline bell of a voice that could cut right through the noise of honking yellow cabs and shouting street vendors. Around 1954, a local vocal group called the Premiers was rehearsing in the neighborhood. Made up of young black and Puerto Rican teens, Herman Santiago, Jimmy Merchant, Joe Negroni, and Sherman Garnes, they were looking for that final ingredient to make their sound pop. 10-year-old Frankie heard them singing on a stoop and casually walked up, chiming in with a soaring high tenor line that stopped the older boys dead in their tracks. They didn't just invite him to join, they realized immediately that this kid was a prodigy. Soon, they changed their name to the Teenagers, and the street corner supergroup was born. Their big break didn't come through a high-priced manager or a corporate talent scout. It came through a neighborhood boy who lived in their building, a kid named Coop, who had written a rough poem based on love letters his girlfriend had sent him. The opening line was simple, almost naive. "Why do birds sing so gay?" The group took that scrap of paper and began turning it into a song. Herman Santiago originally sang the lead vocal, while Frankie helped arrange the vocal backing and wrote the iconic stuttering vocal bass line that would soon sweep the nation. They rehearsed the track relentlessly on rooftop tar, in tenement hallways, and in school bathrooms, anywhere the acoustic bounce made their voices sound bigger than life. In late 1955, the boys managed to land an audition with George Goldner, the head of G Records. Goldner was a fast-talking, sharp-dressing music executive who knew talent when he heard it. But more importantly, he knew how to exploit it. During the audition, Herman Santiago happened to have a cold, so 12-year-old Frankie stepped up to the microphone to sing lead on their signature song, which they had reworked and retitled, "Why Do Fools Fall in Love?" The moment Frankie opened his mouth, the air in the recording studio changed. Goldner's eyes lit up. This wasn't just a good teenage group. This was a gold mine. With Frankie's soaring, joyous lead vocal floating over the group's tight, rapid-fire backing harmonies, Goldner booked studio time immediately. In late 1955, they cut the record. When Why Do Fools Fall in Love hit radio airwaves in early 1956, it didn't just enter the charts. It exploded like a grenade. It rocketed to #1 on the Billboard R&B chart and smashed into the top 10 of the pop charts, an almost unheard-of crossover achievement for a group of minority teenagers in segregated 50s America. The record sold over 1 million copies in a matter of months, earning a gold disc and making Frankie Lymon an overnight global sensation at just 13 years old. Suddenly, the shoeshine boy from Harlem was thrust into an insane whirlwind of fame. The group was rebranded as Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, centering the charismatic kid with the $1 million smile right at the front of the stage. They went on massive Alan Freed rock and roll package tours, playing to wildly screaming crowds across the country. They appeared on nationwide television broadcasts, broke attendance records at the Brooklyn Paramount, and crossed the Atlantic to perform for British royalty at the London Palladium. Frankie was a natural showman. He didn't just sing, he moved with effortless grace, flashing a bright, dazzling grin that captivated millions. For a brief, shining moment, Frankie Lymon was one of the biggest pop stars on planet Earth. They followed up their smash hit with a string of classic singles, including I Want You to Be My Girl, The ABCs of Love, and Goody Goody. They even starred in the landmark 1956 rock and roll film Rock, 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 cementing their status as national icons. Behind the scenes, however, a predatory financial machine was operating at full throttle. George Goldner and the executives at G Records took full advantage of the group's youth, poverty, and lack of legal guidance. They tricked the boys into signing predatory contracts, giving them small weekly allowances for fancy clothes and soda pop, while pocketing millions of dollars in record sales and performance fees. Worse yet, Goldner systematically stripped Herman Santiago and Frankie Lymon of their songwriting credits for Why Do Fools Fall in Love, placing his own name on the publishing registry so he could siphon off every single penny of the song's lucrative performance royalties. By 1957, greedy managers convinced Frankie that he was too big for the group, encouraging him to ditch the Teenagers and go solo. It was a fatal mistake. Without the tight, street-honed harmonies of his childhood friends, Frankie's solo records struggled to capture the same magic. Combined with the onset of puberty, which began altering his pristine soprano, his solo career stalled before it ever really took off. The money dried up almost instantly. The executives stopped taking his calls, and the boy who had conquered the world was left stranded on the curb. When the machinery of fame stripped Frankie of his youth, his voice, and his money, what kind of musical blueprint did he leave behind on vinyl before the darkness swallowed him whole? The vinyl blueprint: singles, albums, and lost projects. When you look past the drama, the stolen royalties, and the heartbreak, What remains is an extraordinary razor-sharp body of recorded work. Frankie Lymon wasn't just a fleeting novelty act, he was a vocal innovator whose studio catalog laid down the absolute genetic blueprint for modern pop, soul, and R&B music. The journey begins in the winter of 1955 with that earth-shattering debut single on G Records, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, backed with Please Be Mine. The A-side was pure electric lightning trapped on wax. From the moment the song kicks off with Sherman Garnes's iconic bass drop, that deep, rhythmic oh-wah, oh-wah, Frankie's lead vocal bursts through the speakers with unbridled joy. His pitch was immaculate, his phrasing was well beyond his 13 years, and his delivery carried an infectious energy that made listeners instantly fall in love. The B-side, Please Be Mine, showcased his soft, vulnerable side, proving that the young Harlem native could handle slow, emotionally rich ballads just as effortlessly as up-tempo rock and roll bangers. Following the massive global explosion of their debut, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers released a breathtaking sequence of singles throughout 1956 that redefined American popular music. In April of that year, they dropped I Want You to Be My Girl, featuring the punchy B-side Together. I Want You to Be My Girl became another massive crossover smash, peaking at number 3 on the R&B charts and breaking into the pop top 20. It featured the exact same high-octane formula, tight, galloping vocal arrangements behind Frankie's soaring, crystal-clear tenor lines, interspersed with snappy, blues-infused saxophone solos. By the summer of 1956, G Records rushed out I Promise to Remember, backed with I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent. The latter track was a masterclass in tongue-in-cheek pop songwriting, specifically crafted to counter the moral panic surrounding rock and roll music at the time. With Frankie's sweet, innocent voice declaring his good intentions, the song became a fan favorite, especially after the group performed it on screen in the hit feature film Rock, Rock, Rock. Later that fall came The ABCs of Love, a bright, catchy track that proved Frankie's vocal charm was seemingly endless, even as the songwriting began to rely on familiar formulas. In December 1956, G Records released the group's one and only full-length studio album, The Teenagers, featuring Frankie Lymon. It was a 12-track masterpiece of mid-century vocal group music, packing together their biggest hit singles alongside stunning album cuts like Cher, Paper Castles, and their brilliant cover of the jazz standard Out in the Cold Again. Listening to that album today, you hear a group of teenagers operating at the absolute peak of their musical powers, blending uptown Harlem street corner doo-wop with the polished, radio-ready production values of downtown New York City. However, greed and poor management quickly broke up the band. 1957, music executives pulled Frankie away from the Teenagers to launch him as a solo artist. His solo debut came with a high-energy cover of the 30s classic Goody Goody, backed with Creation of Love. Goody Goody was a legitimate hit, reaching number 20 on the pop charts and showing that Frankie could comfortably cross over into big band pop standards. He performed the song on television with a full big band orchestra behind him, proving he had the charisma to command a stage all by himself without his teenage backing group. Yet, as 1957 turned into 1958, the solo records started losing their commercial footing. Singles like Thumb Thumb, Portable on My Mind, and Little Girl failed to replicate the explosive success of his early work. Part of the problem was artistic. Record executives tried to mold him into a traditional, clean-cut pop crooner, stripping away the raw, bluesy street corner edge that made his voice so special in the first place. The other problem was biological. Frankie was growing up. As his vocal cords matured, he lost that distinctive razor-sharp high soprano that had captivated the world. By the late 50s and early 60s, Frankie drifted between various record labels, searching for a new sound while quietly struggling with his deepening addiction. He recorded singles for Roulette Records, 20th Century Fox, and Columbia, dropping tracks like Little Bitty Pretty One, It's Christmas Once Again, and Change Partners. While these releases occasionally contained flashes of brilliant, soulful singing, they suffered from inconsistent production and zero promotional backing from labels that viewed him as yesterday's news. In 1964, he recorded a rarely heard solo album for Columbia Records titled Frankie Lymon at the London Palladium, trying to recapture the magic of his overseas tours. But by then, the British invasion led by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones had completely swept through America, leaving traditional doo-wop and early rock and roll artists stranded on the sidelines. The final, most heartbreaking chapter of his discography came in February 1968. Signed to Roulette Records for a long-shot comeback attempt, Frankie was scheduled to enter the studio to record a brand-new slate of songs designed to reinvent him as a mature, soulful R&B vocalist. He had spent weeks practicing, working on arrangements, and convincing friends that he was ready to reclaim his spot at the top. But those studio sessions never happened. He died hours before he was scheduled to lay down the tracks. Those lost 1968 sessions remain one of the great what-ifs in soul music history, leaving behind an unfinished legacy cut short in its prime. So, when the music stopped and the studio lights went dark forever, what was left behind in the quiet air of history? Ghost in the Harmony, the undying legacy. You can strip an artist of their earnings, allow their personal life to devolve into a tabloid spectacle, and leave their physical memory to rot under the soil, but you cannot erase a sonic revolution. Frankie Lymon did not just leave behind a handful of radio hits, he fundamentally altered the architectural DNA of modern popular culture. Before Frankie stepped up to a studio microphone, American pop music was strictly an adult domain. The record charts were controlled by mature crooners and polished big band arrangers tailoring content for older audiences. He utterly shattered that paradigm. He demonstrated to global entertainment conglomerates that young performers, and specifically black teenagers, could write, deliver, and market records directly to their own demographic. He essentially unlocked the multi-billion-dollar youth music economy that continues to drive the global entertainment industry today. Beyond his commercial impact, Lymon broke through massive racial barriers during a heavily segregated era in American broadcasting. During the mid-50s, when black artists were frequently kept off mainstream television or forced to watch their songs re-recorded by white singers, Frankie crossed over into mainstream living rooms across the nation. His charismatic, clean-cut TV appearances helped normalize integrated pop culture for millions of suburban teenagers, paving a smoother path for the civil rights-era musical explosion that followed. His stylistic imprint echoes across virtually every subgenre of modern vocal music. His soaring, pristine soprano laid the blueprint for the entire doo-wop revival movement of the late 50s and early 60s. Beyond pop and R&B, early punk rock icons drawn to raw energy and fast-paced arrangements frequently cited Lymon's mid-50s tracks as a primary inspiration for their stripped-down, high-velocity sound. Tributes to Lymon's brilliance span generations of music history. Major cultural figures have consistently paid homage to his gifts, highlighting how his phrasing influenced their own artistic identities. Frankie Lymon was the first singer who ever really got to me. His voice had a clarity and a purity that went straight to your heart. Every time I hit a high note, I'm thinking of Frankie. When you listen to those early tracks, you aren't just hearing about a talented kid. You're hearing the origin point for the entire sound of young America. I used to stand in front of the mirror as a little boy trying to sing just like Frankie Lymon. The energy, the control, the effortless high range. He was the master we all tried to copy. In addition to vocalists, legendary songwriters and producers have routinely celebrated Lymon's natural instinct for arrangement. His ability to craft complex, interlocking vocal hooks on Harlem street corners without formal musical training remains a point of study for musicologists and studio producers alike. In the decades following his passing, grassroots preservation efforts worked tirelessly to safeguard his memory. While corporate entity battles dragged through courtrooms over rights and revenues, dedicated fan networks and historical preservation groups organized drives to document his full session history and properly archive his radio broadcasts. Community organizations in Harlem established neighborhood tributes recognizing his role as one of the community's greatest cultural exports. Pop culture has continually revisited his life and art as a benchmark for both artistic genius and the perils of early stardom. His recordings regularly feature in major cinematic soundtracks, television period pieces, and historical documentaries focused on the birth of rock and roll. His catalog serves as an enduring masterclass in vocal delivery, studied by incoming generations of session singers and vocal coaches looking for the gold standard of natural tenor resonance. Today, when you hear a young vocal prodigy command a stage or listen to a high-register vocal hook leading a chart-topping hit, you are hearing the lingering reverberations of a Harlem shoeshine boy. The corporate suits may have drained his bank accounts, addiction may have claimed his physical body, and the circus of fame may have cut his life tragically short at 25. Yet, every single time those classic vocal harmonies kick in, Frankie Lymon steps right back into the spotlight, forever youthful, forever brilliant, and permanently etched into the story of American music. Frankie Lymon's voice defined an era, but his tragic story proves how quickly the spotlight fades. If you love deep dives into untold music history and lost legends, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss an episode.